right, I have a few things to say. The first one is my talk has nothing to do with food or any of that. So, the second thing is I wanted to tell a quick story that I don't think Jordan knows because I've actually was in contact with his team a few years ago because I used to be a pretty serious dancer. I trained at the Joffrey Ballet here in New York and retired because of 2 injuries onto my feet. And so he had put out a call on his Instagram for Dancers in the Dark, which if you don't know about, it's where these amazing dancers strip down and then they take the most beautiful photos in the world in the middle of New York City at 3 a.m. And so this was, I think, a little bit before he fully took off, and he had put out a call on his Instagram to say, are there any dancers who would want to shoot with me for Dancers in the Dark? And for reasons that will become obvious, I was bored out of my mind, and I was taking classes, and I was like, you know what? I would love to do this. And so I emailed his team, and we went back and forth for a little bit, and it turned out that I didn't end up being one of the dancers he chose, which was the right call because he chose the most amazing working dancers in New York City, and the book is fantastic. You should all go buy it. But my point with all of this is, Jordan, if you ever want to do a book called Retired Dancers Among Us, I'm your girl. It takes me a while to get up. Things hurt, but you know, it's graceful. So,
Can I just say?
Yeah.
I have my camera with me.
When I got in contact with Michael because of the dancing thing that I did. It was featured on Chopped, so that's how we got in touch. And then I realized that Jordan was part of the Legacy of You, which instantly validated this whole thing for me because I've been a fan of your work for a while. So here we are.
Thanks, Jordan.
Thank you.
Yeah. And now I'm here to talk to you about depression, so this is going to be awesome. Okay. So when they first put you on the drugs, no one ever tells you to remember how to feel. They don't tell you that you might actually forget how to feel, or that you might forget entirely. Instead, they tell you that the lows will be higher and the highs will be lower. They say you'll even out. They say you'll learn to cope. And they tell you it will all be okay. And when you're young, and it's a particularly bad day, they have you look at a feelings poster, which is a series of expressive cartoon faces with their faces all scrunched up into things like irritated and angry and confused and ashamed. But there's no cartoon face for meh. And there's no cartoon face for fine. And you are fine, sort of. Smiling here, waving there, living and breathing as you're supposed to do, but in a strange foggy haze that one day, quietly, becomes normal. And when you get off the meds, if you get off the meds, the edges start to appear, and you start to feel, but you realize you've forgotten how feelings work because the medication did that part for you for so long. And then one day, you find yourself standing alone on the streets of New York City in the pouring rain, watching as all of the feelings and memories come back all at once. At least that's how it went for me. I was diagnosed with PTSD, chronic depression, and anxiety as a result of my father's tragic death when I was 15. And I'm 31 now, which means that for half of my life and my entire adult life, not only was I medicated, but I was living under the impression that I was somehow broken, and that I was broken because of something that I didn't do, but because of something that happened to me. Not that what happened to me wasn't terrible. When I was 15, before my sophomore year of high school, I was in Italy with my mother when my father went into what we thought was a routine ulcer surgery. The ulcer turned out to be a pancreatic cancer mass that had gone undiagnosed, and he never woke up from surgery that night. My mom and I were immediately escorted off where we were in Italy into the Naples airport in the back of a black cab. We traveled for 2 days and went straight to the hospital where we found my father hooked up to life support in the ICU. And some days later, my mom turned off the machines. A little bit after that, the adults in my life decided that I wasn't coping properly, whatever that meant at the time. And they put me on a cocktail of anti-anxiety and anti-anxiety drugs designed to help me cope, I suppose, but I think really it was to help me cope on a timeline that was more convenient for everybody else. And I was eventually released from therapy, not because I was cured, but because I refused to talk, because I knew that pointing at a sad face on a feelings poster was a waste of my time. And so they let me go, and I just kept taking the pills day after day as prescribed. And then years went by, and I was doing fine. But what we didn't realize at the time was that I was losing large chunks of my memories. And of course, for anyone as we grow, we forget things, but the extent of my memory loss was broad and a little strange. To put this into perspective, when I was about 13, a strange Russian woman lived in my house for about 2 months. There are tons of photos of us together, but when I look back on them, I have no recollection of who this woman is or what she was doing in my house. And it's not like we lived in a mansion or we had a large house or that there were vagrants coming in and out, but we were a small family. We lived in a modest house, and this woman and I shared a bathroom. So that fact alone, as a teenager, should be enough to ping my memories, but it doesn't. And it wasn't just that. I only vaguely remember details from 9/11. I was just 15, and a few months later my father had passed, so it's all kind of fuzzy. But I definitely don't remember moving out of my childhood home a few months later. I don't remember when my mom left town to deal with the logistics of death and left me with my aunt. I don't remember when my other aunt passed away of pancreatic cancer just a few months after that. I don't remember my own mother's cancer diagnosis when I was 17. I don't remember leaving for college. I don't remember many details of my freshman year roommate or what classes I took that year. I don't remember moving to New York. I don't remember how I got my first job. I don't remember meeting my first New York City boyfriend. He just sort of appears fully formed in my mind. And I could always operate from day to day. But what happened was that after a few weeks, it was just kind of like a lot of the information about people fell out of my mind. And since I was still operating day to day and I had no frame of reference, we all just thought that I was doing fine. But I got really, really good at pretending to be a fully functioning adult by doing stupid things like going on OkCupid dates and starting a boozy bakery in New York City. Only one of those things went arguably well. And when I wasn't going on bad dates or baking boozy cupcakes, I spent the majority of my time in this very strange half-in, half-out state on my couch, watching endless hours of Dateline and playing Candy Crush Saga. I'm on level 1,728, which is either really impressive or tragic, depending on who you are. But at the time, watching Dateline was the only thing that made me feel alive. And that's because when I was watching Dateline, I was acutely aware that I was not on Dateline. Because if you're on Dateline, you're either murdered or in prison. And I needed the reminder that I was neither murdered or in prison in order to convince myself that things could always be worse. But then again, watching all of the Dateline made me realize that it would also be very easy to either be murdered or in prison, so I would play all the Candy Crush Saga to calm down. And eventually I just got good at this existence and started playing Candy Crush while I was watching Dateline, because I decided that if I was going to be anxious and depressed, I was going to be efficiently anxious and depressed. And then in the fall of 2015, a few months away from my 30th birthday, it occurred to me that I was still shockingly depressed for someone who had spent so many years on depression and anti-anxiety medication. And beyond that, it occurred to me also that I had never made the choice to go on these medications in the first place. I had simply done what the adults in my life at the time had told me to do, and yet in 15 years, the adults in my life had never thought to ask whether or not my medication needed to be changed. Every time I moved or got a new doctor, they asked what I was on, and I told them, and presumably because I had been on it for so long and I hadn't killed myself yet, I think they deduced that it was working, and they just gave me a new prescription, and we all just went on our way. And because I had no frame of reference, because I had been on these medications for so long, and also because I couldn't remember anything, I had grown to believe that who I was on medications was who I actually was. And then when I was on that couch watching Deadly Twist or The Secret of Snake River, I decided that if I was going to spend another 15 years on medication, I was going to be the one to make the decision to do that. And I needed to find a baseline first so I understood who I was and what I was working with. But I couldn't find that baseline without first going off all the medication I was on. And the prospect of detox felt scarier than the medications themselves. And so I waited for a few months. And then I got accepted into a program called Remote Year. It's a year-long social experiment designed to send 75 digital nomads around the world for a year together. And I have to say that 2 of my friends who were on that trip are here tonight, so that's amazing. But together, all of us, all 75 of us, like traveling as a unit around the damn world, would go to 10 countries across 3 continents, from Malaysia to Croatia to Argentina. And I realized that from a practical standpoint, I did not want to deal with having to get these sorts of medications abroad. And I also didn't want to put myself in a situation where I'd be in a third world country and couldn't get my meds and then would be forced into detox without planning for it. And from an emotional standpoint, I didn't want to travel around the world and forget the whole thing. So on a random Tuesday in March of 2016, I began weaning myself off all the medications, one by one, by one, by one, by one, 5 in all. The consequences of getting off these medications have been as dire as they are magnificent. I anticipated lower lows and higher highs, but what I didn't understand was that there would be major changes in my physical body. I suddenly had an unbearable sensitivity to light and sound, and during my effects or withdrawal, I had to lock myself in my apartment because I couldn't go out into New York City without feeling like it was a vortex of energy and noise that I could not turn down. I told important people in my life that things were happening, and there's another important person here tonight as well who was there for a little bit of that, and he supported me and helped me through it. In a way that I still appreciate. He was my boss at the time, and thank God he let me work from home. But what happened was that my physical body just kind of went into overdrive. And suddenly, what seemed normal to me became incredibly abnormal. I literally ripped off my clothing because things I had worn for years felt unbearably itchy. I bent an ironing board in half during a fit of rage, and I sobbed like a child if I stubbed my toe or got a paper cut. Because suddenly, without all these medications, 15 years of untreated anger, depression, and anxiety flooded through my system like a broken dam into the desert. And then, one day, I got caught in the rain. It was one of the first warm nights of spring, and I was wearing short sleeves for the first time that year. And the rain came suddenly, without warning, as it tends to do in New York, and I didn't have an umbrella. But as I picked up the pace to get home, I noticed that for the first time in my life, I could feel the raindrops on my skin, the individual raindrops. I had been covered in a layer of cellophane for so long that the raindrops could never penetrate. And that layer of cellophane existed over all aspects of my life, and suddenly without it, the protection and the shelter from my memories and feelings was gone too. And so I stood in the rain in the middle of New York soaking wet, and suddenly I started feeling and remembering all of these things that I had not remembered for so long. I remembered standing and watching a rainstorm in rural North Carolina with that first New York City boyfriend. I remembered when my mother told me of her cancer diagnosis. I remembered sitting in my father's car and listening to the rain on the sunroof in the months after he died. And I remembered the thunderstorm from the night he died because we lived in a desert, so that was strange. And I remembered the gray curls on the taxi driver that drove us to the Naples airport, and the way the cobblestones looked in the moonlight because it had just rained that night as well. And now, it's 1.5 years later, and I'm back from traveling around the world, and for the first time in my adult life, I'm able to compare my life in New York City to before drugs and after drugs. And I have to say that it's incredibly different, and that New York City is really fucking loud, and I don't like it. But on the good days, I've noticed that I don't even have to try, because my memories are just there. Because on the good days, I can remember. Because on the good days, I can feel the rain. Thank you.